Greetings. Today I'm going to break down how I produced quite possibly the strangest and most unhinged track that I've ever made, so far anyway. So what exactly do I mean by unhinged? Because I feel like that's fairly open to interpretation. Yeah, so there's quite a bit going on in this one. So I called this track Odyssey, and it will become apparent why I called it that. And I released this earlier this year as my alias Luo. With this track, my aim was to kind of combine and pay homage to several of my favourite styles of music and sort of quite unrelated genres and artists from completely different time periods, eras and aesthetics. And I basically wanted to see if I could kind of smash all of these things together somehow without the track just becoming a hot, gimmicky mess.
Breakcore can be downbeat, heavy and slow, or really crazy and fast.
You have like the drum and bass sound, but also like the happy hardcore sound. You got all different kinds of mixtures, and that's what I like about breakcore.
Everyone is repeating their own history in making music, you know. I mean, breakcore samples a lot of existing music.
Samples von irgendwelchen Disco-Krachern oder Popnummern oder irgendwelchen Country-Songs oder Western-Songs und so und verpacken die halt.
Kind of more like a guided tour through a bunch of music that I love. So with all that said, let's get straight into it. This is my main project for this tune, or actually the only one that I could seem to find for it. It's a pretty busy session. You can see there's about 160 tracks. So to start out with, I'll talk about this kind of opening IDM section. Primarily inspired by Venetian snares.
Breakcore, you know, breakcore gives me wood.
What I was attempting to do with this beat was
breakcore
in 7/4, but it doesn't quite feel like it's in 7. There are certain beats or patterns that I would say the obvious choice. I'm pretty sure people will know what I'm talking about here. And yeah, I was just kind of trying to avoid that, and the way that I think you do that is to just kind of have phrasings in the beat that kind of go over the bar line here, so you can see that's what's happening with this kick. And that is coming from something called Kick 2 by Sonic Academy, which I had just got at the time. So as the name implies, obviously this is pretty good for designing and synthesizing your own kick drum sounds. The two things that I was sort of messing around with initially is you can see this length control here. Sort of enables you to use the kick drum like a bass at the same time. And then the other control that was getting me excited was this distortion control down here. So yeah, that kind of hardcore, gabber, stupid, dumb, heavy breakcore kick.
You know what you want to do with that, right? You want to put a banging donk on it. Bassline! Oh, wicked! Now put a donk on it.
Basically group each part of the drum section in different stages. So if I just solo the kick and snare groups together. So it's dragging hits in like that and then manually putting them on different grid spaces and kind of doing creative things, making little stutters out of the sample or reversing them, putting different effects on them. And then when you're doing that on individual tracks, you can see I've got an audio track for each one of these. It means I can just get everything exactly perfect how I want it to sound. And obviously, again, this involves a lot of sample hunting, and I'm usually very particular about that.
I am very particular.
In terms of the samples that I select to be in the sequence. And that's kind of how I start constructing things. Let's solo the hats in there as well. So, and it obviously sounds like there's things missing because there's other things happening down here that are going to kind of complete the gaps in the pattern and the groove. Here I've got some claps. And these are just, again, that sounds like an 808 clap or something, and I probably would have just put something like Valhalla have another reverb plugin called Supermassive that's actually free, and I think I've probably used one of the presets in that is like the largest possible reverb that you could use. When you put that on like a clap sample with the main snare hit, obviously that just gives you a nice kind of blooming thing. Then soloing in the next group, I've got some whooshes, which is basically like reversed snare samples or reversed drums. Putting those behind snares or sort of key moments can help them have a little bit more impact. Then I've got this kind of percussion / glitches kind of group. Let's see what happens when I add these in. This water effect here I would have got from putting Texture by Devious Machines, probably one of the whooshes, one of those reverse whooshes that I'd made earlier. Yeah, so putting that sort of thing on like a reverse snare can get you some quite interesting textures as well. And then these other little blips and blops, these reactor cuts, actually, that's kind of fun to talk about. Reactor has got all of these things in it called groove boxes. They're basically like little drum machines. Where they get quite interesting is adding kind of glitchy plugins to them and just messing with them even further. So I'll get out good old Live Cut. So recording little snippets of that kind of garbage and then sequencing it in with the rest of the drums is what I've done here. So that's kind of what these little reactor cuts are referring to. So I'll give you a play of those on their own. Another one in here that I really, really like is this thing called Space Drone in Reactor. Yeah, it's really good for kind of background ambience and that kind of thing. Then last but not least, there are some Amen breaks down here. So I get asked reasonably often why I use Logic and Ableton and why I don't just use one DAW. Something that I would say Ableton has a massive advantage over Logic with is its integration of USB gear and assigning MIDI controls to effects. Ableton just makes it really light, easy work, and it's really hands-on and user-friendly. And I would say that Logic is not particularly user-friendly when it comes to trying to sync MIDI devices and things like that. And basically what I'm about to do here, it's not like you couldn't exactly do it in Logic, it's just going to be much easier to do it here. So I will use Ableton for little tasks like this and then import what I've done in it back into the Logic session. So that's a pretty standard version of the Amen break, and I'm just going to chuck a beat repeat on that and change it to instrument mode. I'm going to assign the grid knob to a knob on the Korg Nano control and the repeat button to one of the on-offs. And then I'm going to turn the chance down. And now I can kind of manually grab this and go. So I can start manually getting some glitches out of that. But I'm going to add a few more things. So I'm going to insert an audio effect rack so I can put a bunch of stuff in it. And I'm going to chuck maybe like some distortions and that kind of things in there. So this audio effect rack, I'm going to assign a control to turn on that audio effect rack so I can control when that distortion and all that stuff kind of kicks in. So and let's maybe just put like texture in between the overdrive and the drum bus there. So and then one last thing, let's maybe try putting Effectrix on that, because Effectrix can do some quite cool things as well. So So yeah, that's basically what's going on with the electronic drums. It's all pretty much like manually sequencing most individual hits, putting different effects on them and kind of reversing them and doing fun edits to create this dialogue or conversation with drums where all these different layers are interacting with each other in different ways, and kind of, you know, obviously individually they sound quite random and scatty, but when you put them all together, they kind of combine to make the full drum section. So as you can see, this is the prog bit, and yeah, kind of progressive rock vibe is what I was aiming for. So this section is entirely based around the guitar part, and it is this simple kind of looping melody here. Building that up around this drums groove. I would have originally programmed this drum groove with Addictive Drums too, to use that as a kind of like a demo or a guide, but then this was actually recorded for real by my good pal Barney Sage. So this is actually real acoustic drums that he recorded in his studio. And like, so something to mention about this is just a single stereo track that is summed down, maybe a little bit weird for a drum mix, but basically Barney, to record his drums, he used a preset that I created, which we used for our album Unspoken. And then I would have just rendered that down to this single audio track, which would have just made it too dense for my machine to handle at the time, basically. But because I know what my drum preset is that I gave him, it's like I can kind of confidently work with it and mix the rest of the track around it, which I don't think you would necessarily be able to do in most situations unless you had that kind of setup going. Bass is kind of fun because, again, I would have printed this to audio, but it would have been my 5-string bass running through Neural DSP's Parallax plugin, Universal Audio's, I think it was the UAD Moog multi-mode filter, I think it was this, and then using that kind of like an envelope filter essentially to get that kind of thundercat-y, squelchy. But actually putting the filter before Parallax, so the filter's like feeding into all that kind of distortion. And then you get... And when you combine that with the sort of bass distortion, you can get some pretty cool, interesting effects out of that, I think. So you can see that I've also copy-pasted some of my electronic perks and drums that were happening from the first section over Barney's acoustic drums here. So we get a kind of nice hybridized acoustic prog drums meets IDM beat sandwich, basically, which is something I love doing in my productions. And then, yeah, we hit this industrial section, which is kind of an improvised build-up around a looping bass riff, which I created using my kind of doom bass technique. I'm just going to see if I can sort of quickly try and recreate that bass sound. So starting in Ableton with just basically dragging analog onto a default track here, and the bass loop is something like this. Very boring. Let's drop that an octave. Maybe another one. Audio effect rack is going to go on. and basically a load of like distortion and weird glitchy plugins and stuff. Looperator by Sugar Bytes also has some nice presets in it that can do quite nice. Then at the end of that we'll put a filter. And then a beat repeat somewhere in here so that I can do my kind of manual glitch starter thing. Yeah, as you can see, that's just given me a load of bass effect stuff to work with. So everything's kind of going to be building up around that. Partway through that, the synth bass kind of drops out, and instead my 5-string bass kicks in, just kind of doing this simple riff with the kick and snare of what Barney's doing, basically. It's nice to have something to play on the neck and just kind of riff out with for a little bit. So. Probably the most noticeable thing here, apart from that, is the quote, the movie quote.
This is a quote from a film.
This is a quote from a film. Well, not really a film. This is a quote from a trailer for a film.
In the basement of one of the country's leading medical schools, Dr. candidate for a Nobel Prize, is starting the most dangerous experiment in the history of science.
What I would have done with that is, again, run it through a similar process that I did with the percussion earlier. Plugins like Live Cut or Beat Repeat in Ableton, and then kind of like manually mangling the sample and getting those glitchy stutters and things happening out of it. There's a heat wave here today, so I'm pretty hot. Apologies if I look a little bit sweaty. Okay, so that brings me on to, of course, the heavy bit.
I calls them like I sees them. I'm a whale biologist.
So yeah, there's a little bit of influence from Doom, but also the Tenet score by Ludwig Göransson. And in that movie, he likes to do a lot of these, you hear a lot of these synth parts, which are these kind of portamento things, this constant tension in them because the pitch is always kind of wavering around. And then kind of the second main element here is obviously this big, gnarly Doom-style bass. Making that kind of sound basically involves putting a ton of distortion and compression on something like a sine sub bass, and then putting a bunch of other effects on it to get those kind of cool kind of textures in there. But yeah, as soon as you start doing that, then basically what happens is you lose all of that, the low end of the sub in the sound. So to counteract that, I've actually added that bass in with another clean sub bass sine layer under it. So if I just play that to you without it and then solo that in, and now with the clean sub. So yeah. So that's the kind of sub bass that, you know, rattles in the chest and makes your eye sockets vibrate and makes it feel like your teeth are about to fall out when you see it at a concert, which is great. That's what I kind of want out of that section, is this pure, like, oh my god, that's actually a bit of an assault of my ears. And then yeah, that combined with the drums. So you can see what I've done here is quad track the guitars, but I've only quad tracked the opening bongs just to get those bits really heavy. The rest of the rhythm with these little stabs here are just the double track guitars. But the way that I achieve this, so the tone is basically coming from Yeah, Archetype Petrucci has got this transpose function in it. This guitar part here, it sounds kind of like an 8-string, right? I mean, it's pretty low. If you've seen my most recent video, you may know that I actually now own an 8-string, but at the time when I made this track, I didn't, and I did this on a 6-string, and the way that I achieved that tone was to use the transpose function in Archetype Petrucci to pitch my guitar down an entire octave on a 6-string, and then that is how I'm able to get that that kind of low, genty, heavy metal tone. I actually own a couple of other pedals for pitch shifting. The really popular and pretty famous DigiTech Whammy and the TC Electronics Sub and Up octave pedal. There's something about it that is just different using this plugin's transpose function compared to using the DigiTech Whammy, I found. In fact, I could cut away to a quick comparison of that. Let's see what that's like, actually. But yeah, if you don't have a DigiTech Whammy, or if you don't have another pedal that can kind of do that octave pitch shifting thing, it is really, really cool that these plugins enable you to do that. So it sounds kind of crazy, but I think what's going on is actually simpler than what it appears to sound like. Most of it is in 7/4, although there are a couple little bits of it where it dips back to 4/4. So this is a little bit weird about the process sometimes because I've made this track in my studio. I'm now in the process of actually learning that live with my drum and bowl and attempting to kind of translate it to a track that would work in a live performance context. In terms of thinking about how to approach it as a drummer, maybe, or thinking to break down what's going on here, you could count it in 7/4. I'll show you what that sounds like. So. Just makes it a bit weird to kind of count it that way. And then the thing that's kind of buried in here is that it's like a Purdy shuffle triplet groove. So it's actually got that kind of, it's almost more like a 6/8 waltz than it is something in 7/4. So if I put a metronome over this that is counting in triplets, I think it kind of reveals what's actually going on. What's weird is that the triplet count runs perfectly throughout this, even though the time signature changes. So I guess that's kind of what's kind of interesting about that section is if when you count it in threes like that, it suddenly dissolves the illusion of it being weird and you're like, oh, I can actually kind of follow that now. But without that, I haven't made that triplet count super obvious in the rhythm. It's kind of obfuscated, but that is, if you're thinking about that in your head whilst you're listening to it and playing it, that's what will get you through it, rather than thinking about it being this weird fucking herky-jerky thing in 7. So I think that's quite interesting and kind of ended up happening by accident. And then, yeah, that obviously brings us on to just a little moment of breathing space. Basically, after that brings us to this kind of more ambient acoustic section.
Well, biologist.
So we have one chord progression here, and then there's a kind of harmonic melody that happens over the top of this, which I recorded on a separate nylon string guitar. So. One of the ways that I fumble my way around playing guitar as a self-taught musician is I do a lot of using the open 2 top strings in picking riffs and then just kind of finding chord shapes below and moving my fingers around until I find places where they kind of interact with the open 2 top strings, the E and the B. So. There's quite a lot of combinations and different ways to chain all of that kind of stuff together, and a lot of them are kind of like jazz chord shapes as well, that I like a lot, so, or like fragmented. I rarely, in my playing, it's a bit weird, I rarely use like bar chords or those kind of shapes. Might only be holding down 3 strings at a time, and then the rest of it is kind of open strings, so... Now moving on to the kind of harmonic. So yeah, at certain points along the neck, there are all these different spots where you can get different harmonic notes by just, rather than actually pressing down the string and fretting it, you know, if you just hold your finger lightly over that and then pluck it, you get the harmonic. But there are a few other spots, and yeah, particularly on the 7th and 12th fret, but also in some places on the 4th and 5th. You can get other notes, and then you can construct melodies with them with this. The tone of the harmonic, I think, is just a really, really nice sound. So it's fun to kind of work that in, but it takes a little bit of getting used to. Yeah, it's a little bit weird for your brain to get used to at first, because obviously my fretting finger is lower down the neck here, but because I'm playing these as harmonic notes, I'm playing the 7th fret on the B string and then the 12th fret harmonic on the E string. I'm getting that. So yeah, it's a bit confusing because basically the higher note is lower on the neck. So the relationship's reversed. But that's kind of interesting, and that's what can help lead you to some kind of cool melodies when you start experimenting with this, basically. So the melody that I play initially on this is I'm just going between basically string skipping and going 12-7, 12-7, 12-7, 12-7. And the little bit here that goes with the lower guitar part that I'm actually fretting and playing, it's this little pattern that goes. And then you can literally just move that up. So you get that kind of phrasing out of it, which is pretty cool, I think. And yeah, when you start introducing rhythms like that, or groupings, then that's how you can start to come up with cool parts with harmonics, I think. So. Yeah, that kind of glitchy, stuttered effect on the guitar harmonic there, that's coming from the Boss Terra Echo pedal, which I basically use as a one-trick pony to do that exact thing. I just wanted to reference with this section just kind of my love of moody acoustic folk music, I would say. So artists like Nick Drake, Gravenhurst, and also particularly this harmonic part here. I'll be quite upfront that I was very much inspired by a guitarist called Matt Calvert, probably best known as the guitarist of a band called Three Trap Tigers. And one of the things that he likes to do is creating melodies using guitar harmonics, basically. Yeah, that's essentially what I was trying to kind of go for, or reference a little bit here, because I was just quite obsessed with his electronic acoustic album Typewritten. And then that brings us on to the home stretch here, which is the sort of final acoustic build to the outro. What I was trying to do with this was experiment with chromaticism and chromatic notes moving around, you know, like having the bass note move down a semitone whilst your top melody note moves up a semitone, and actually having that sound musical. Yeah, something I love about chromatic guitar parts, because it's like when you just play a chromatic sequence, you know, by itself, that sounds really unmusical, and it's just kind of, it's like garbage noise, right? But when you I find it interesting trying to find ways to make chromatic movements harmonically pleasing. A really good famous example of that is Paul McCartney's Blackbird guitar riff. Another riff I also really like from Final Fantasy VII, Vincent's theme has this really cool chromatic part in it, which is like... The subtle interplay of how that works is why that is such a cool guitar part, and that's kind of something that I was trying to toy with here. So after this whole journey of the IDM opening, the sort of Prog-Fusion section, the industrial, weird, improvised groove bit, and then the really, really heavy dark section, finally we've come full circle. You're back where you started, but things are different. The programming that I did earlier returns for this final outro here. However, it is shifted into 5/4 time signature. So I have kind of altered this beat, the 7/4 opening beat, so that it kind of fits within the 5/4 meter now. So I would have done that by quite painstakingly shuffling around all of these hits and basically changing the pattern so that it's going to work in this time signature. And then that guitar part is obviously from the previous section, but kind of tied over, so we have a reference back to that ties us all together. So lastly, I just wanted to touch on the technique that I kind of accidentally, or I guess like naturally, ended up implementing. And this is what I think makes the whole track function, basically. Is almost every section of this track has something in it that references the previous section that came before it. And in some cases that's quite obvious and more noticeable, and in other cases it's kind of more subtle. But I think this is how I was able to bring context to all of these quite kind of disparate ideas and have them threaded together. And so just as a vague example of that, the second prog rock section borrows the IDM production from the section before it and brings a bit of that over. The industrial section borrows part of the synth top line from the previous prog section, so you get a little bit of that in there as well. And then of course the later acoustic guitar ambient section references back to the guitar part that was in the prog section earlier. And then of course the IDM beats coming all back at the end, and the guitar is kind of like having certain elements echoing or resonating and reoccurring throughout the track is what I think is subtly gluing all of this kind of nonsense together, basically. And I think that's quite fun to think about from a writing perspective, because it's kind of revealed to me that I could basically do any kind of wacky genre combinations or take this musical journey in any direction between the intro and the outro of the track. And so long as this kind of technique is incorporated, then it should kind of end up functioning as a listenable piece of music regardless of what happens in between, right? And I thought it was worth sharing about this track, but that's pretty much most of what I can think to say about this. As I mentioned earlier, I'm currently in the process of bringing this track into live sets with my drummer, and we're building up to shoot a live video performance of us actually playing it for real at some point for this channel. Hopefully that will be out at some point this year. We'll see how we get on with that. I am currently trying to finish some new music, so if you like what I do and you want to support the channel and all of that stuff, consider checking out my music as my alias Luo on Bandcamp, or just check out some of the other videos on my channel here if you've enjoyed this. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up here for today. Thanks very much for watching, and I shall hopefully catch you in my next upload. But until then, take it easy.